Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Chris Alexandraki, and on behalf of Lux Flag, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the next session and last for today of the Lux Flag Sustainable Investment Week. I'm pleased to introduce this session titled Digital Solutions for Sustainability Data and Regulatory Compliance, hosted by the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, a public technological research organization. I'm really looking forward to hear what are the solutions for regulatory compliance and sustainability data. For that, I'm pleased to have with us today Flavio Garcea and Claudia Hitaj. At his job at Clearstream, Flavio examines how new technologies like blockchain may be used to the infrastructure of the capital markets. Claudia Hitaj is a research and technology associate in the Environmental Sustainability and Circularity Unit of the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology since 2019. Dear speakers, the floor is yours.
Is it on? Thank you so much. I know this is the last session. I hope we can all do this together. I am really pleased to be here with Flavio from Clearstream. As you heard, he is an expert in everything digital, so he'll know the answer to all of your questions. I'm confident.
No pressure.
Exactly. And so what we've got basically a sort of panel format. So we're going to be discussing here. I'm going to be asking the questions. He'll have all the answers. And then I will also present what we do at LIST. So, but first, we heard the word blockchain. And just to set the stage, so I am not really in finance. I'm an environmental economist. So I'm all about, how do we measure environmental impact? And so now when I hear the word blockchain, my first reaction is, I don't know about the environmental impact of blockchain. And then I also admit to just kind of not liking something I don't fully understand. I wonder if there's other people in the audience who feel the same way. So I think this will be an interesting conversation. So this is my standpoint. So now Flavio will be here to tell us about what is great about blockchain and what kind of solutions can it bring to sustainable finance. So first, blockchain, what is it? What kind of different types of blockchain are there? What's the environmental impact? Tell us all about blockchain.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Lux Flag, for having me, and thank you, LIST, as well, for the invite. I'm really delighted to be here. So blockchain, where do I start? So you mentioned environmental impact, and that's a great start to our conversation because blockchain is often in the spotlight in terms of its carbon footprint. But I think there's also a lot of misconceptions around that. So I'll try as quickly as possible to summarize.
Guilty.
Yeah. So, you mentioned different types of blockchain and also the consensus mechanism. So for anyone who's not familiar with it, the consensus mechanism is what a blockchain network uses to validate transactions on the network. So when a transaction is validated, it gets stored immutably in the blockchain ledger, which is like a kind of database. Each blockchain network will select a consensus mechanism which is compatible with its objectives. So if we think about the first ever blockchain network, Bitcoin, its objective is to allow anybody to pay anybody else without the need for a financial intermediary or an intermediary in general. So it's a network that has no KYC, anyone can join it, anyone can get on there and make payments. So when you have an open network like that, how do you ensure that nobody is able to cheat or corrupt the data on it? And that's where the consensus mechanism comes in. And the way Bitcoin's consensus mechanism works, called proof of work, is that many different validators, which are basically computers all over the world, compete to calculate very complex mathematical puzzles. And the first to do it is the one that validates the next transaction, and they get rewarded in Bitcoin. So essentially, the incentive to be a validator is that you get paid for your work. But crunching numbers on a computer is extremely resource intensive. And when you have thousands of computers competing against each other, you get a kind of arms race where everyone needs the fastest computer so that they get there first and get their reward. And so this inevitably caused a kind of arms race in the Bitcoin consensus mechanism, which I checked this morning. Currently, they estimate that the Bitcoin network annually consumes about as much electricity as the whole country of the Netherlands. So a country of 17 million people. But that's just part of the picture. So Bitcoin is 40% of the overall blockchain ecosystem. So it's a sizable chunk. But it's important to look at what the other 60% are doing as well. So the second largest network, Ethereum, recently moved from proof of work to another consensus mechanism called proof of stake. And the difference there is, so they estimate a 99% energy efficiency gain by that move. And the reason for that is that proof of stake, to become a validator, you don't compete against other validators. You need to hold a large stake in the cryptocurrency in question. So for Ethereum, that would be Ether. The principle being that if you have a lot of skin in the game, you don't want that network to come down. You don't want the price to crash because of somebody cheating on the network or something as well. So essentially your incentive is to maintain your own wealth by keeping the consensus mechanism going. So instead of having thousands of computers calculating, you have just one that's chosen at random for each block that needs to get validated. That's just one other consensus mechanism. There are other ones as well that have been created. So it's important to remember the trend in the blockchain ecosystem is to go towards efficiency and scalability. Nonetheless, 40% still on proof of work is still, I guess, an issue. It's up to each of us to decide whether that's a problem or not. There's two things to consider. How is the electricity sourced? Is it renewable or not? Estimates vary from 20% renewable to 60% renewable for Bitcoin. Again, we can all decide whether we think that's good enough or not. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And the second thing to consider is the utility. Should we tolerate that kind of energy consumption because Bitcoin has other social utility? For example, crypto is being used increasingly for remittances, so sending money abroad. It's a lot faster and a lot cheaper than some of the more traditional remittance methods that are used to send money abroad. So for example, people sending money to family in a developing country. Anyway, I didn't want to ramble. The idea, what I'm trying to say is we shouldn't paint the whole ecosystem with the Bitcoin brush because there are concerted efforts to make the blockchain ecosystem more efficient.
Thank you, Flavio. So I definitely need to update my opinion on blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And if the future is indeed going certainly away from proof of work to proof of stake and other consensus mechanisms, then that's good news for the environment for sure. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the role of blockchain in finance? And what are you doing as this kind of knowledgeable person on digital things at Clearstream?
So in terms of finance, so blockchains are really good at managing processes that have many stakeholders, that have lots of repeatable processes, and that have a notion of value transfer. So it was recognized not long after Bitcoin was launched that blockchain technology could potentially help us in financial services and also in capital markets more specifically. Yes.
Oh, yeah, the second question, that
Yeah.
was what is Clearstream doing in terms of...
Sorry, I just remembered what I was going to say. So for many years, there was a lot of talk about blockchain in financial system, but not much doing. And the main reason for that was that we were missing a second key component, at least for regulated markets, and that was the regulatory piece. In Europe, it's only since about last year that we have the kind of regulatory clarity that we know to actually allow us to start building infrastructure using Bitcoin. So for example, in Luxembourg, we have the Blockchain 2 Act, which is actually one of the most advanced in Europe right now. The Electronic Securities Act in Germany, which actually at Clearstream we started using right away to allow us to dematerialize issuance of securities in Germany. And also on a European level, we have several initiatives to harmonize regulation across the bloc. For example, you have MiCAR for the regulation of crypto assets, but also for capital markets, very interesting, the so-called pilot regime, which allows us potentially to streamline both trading and post-trading under one DLT network. And at Clearstream, that's exactly what we're starting to look at now. We recognize a lot of benefits of using blockchain for the post-trade value chain, so from issuance, settlement, custody, and also asset servicing. For example, it's very possible to achieve real-time settlement and reconciliation of securities transactions, but also automation of corporate actions using smart contracts, whether that's a simple dividend payment or a more complex corporate action or event that requires input from the investor. One important piece of what we're doing in terms of the new infrastructure we're building is we're looking at creating smart digital instruments. So what that is essentially, it's a fully digital security in which you can embed all kinds of data. So the classic static data that belongs to a security, but also transactions data. It can include legal data, so for example, the content you need to publish a prospectus or a KID document. And in future, you could think about all kinds of other data. So in terms of ESG, some of the financial and non-financial data that you want to link to a security and that you need to measure performance and other ESG KPIs that you want to measure.
I have a little surprise question for you. On smart contracts,
Yeah.
Since you were mentioning that, just to explain in my lay term, it means that you have everything is embedded in this whatever blockchain, that you cannot change it afterwards. So let's imagine something like war in Ukraine happens and you actually don't want to pay Russia something. You cannot change that smart contract, right?
Very, very good question.
So,
a tricky one. So it depends. So a lot of people are talking about decentralized finance right now. So that could be an exchange that runs without an intermediary. And there it can occur that when you have smart contracts that are implemented, it's very possible, it's very difficult to roll them back once they're out there. If we're talking about regulated markets, we can build in the kind of safeguards that we might want to avoid that. So it's a real...
So there's like room for error if we say, oops, we actually...
Rather than room for error, I think there's room for building safeguards.
Okay.
If the error is there, potentially you could still, that could still occur. But the idea is to, not everything has to be on-chain either. You can build hybrid systems where, for areas where you need to avoid that kind of immutability problem, you can use off-chain solutions as well. But they're still very linked with the blockchain network.
Thanks. So now I wanted to kind of go to other digital solutions. I'll talk a little bit about one thing we're doing at List. So we noticed that, and we've spent the whole day talking about different types of data, ESG data, carbon footprint, etc. So when it comes to reporting all of that data, right now it's pretty much still reported in PDF document oftentimes, right? And this is, it's unstructured, not machine readable. So one of the things we've developed at List is to use natural language processing combined with data visualizations to really help users collect lots of different sustainability data from these different PDF documents, so the KID document, the prospectus, etc. So this is something I could come up with that is another digital solution. So where do you see other digital solutions coming into play? What else do we need to look out for in the future?
So, I think natural language processing that you've mentioned is a key example. And on a wider base, artificial intelligence in general and machine learning can help us a lot. As we try to manage more data, more complex data sets, AI can really help us structure that data, validate that data, analyze that data, and also automate a lot of tasks around that data. So that's definitely a key area. Another one that's maybe discussed a little less in financial services, but I think is equally valid, is Internet of Things. So using sensors to automatically capture data in the real world. And specifically in terms of ESG, there's a lot of things you could do there to measure the efficiency of engines, measure, I don't know, fridge temperatures. The possibilities are endless to really capture all kinds of real-time data that we might want to measure ESG KPIs.
I think I'm really excited about what you said there. I mean, I could imagine also using satellite data to monitor emissions from agriculture or forests and so on. Yeah, it could be very excited to see that and to have that then automated and stored in a blockchain. So now we'll move on to kind of now that we've solved everything in this realm, we'll move on to regulatory compliance. So I familiarized myself with, let's say, 80% of the acronyms that are floating around. And I've realized that, I mean, we all know there's now a lot of new data that everyone needs to come up with or supply in some way, right? So these are all the CSRD, non-financial disclosures, MiFID, RTS, PAIs, etc. And just a quick question to the audience. Has anyone had to deal with the European ESG template, EET? No? So when I've spoken to people, they have felt a bit, overwhelmed by this huge Excel file and all of the fields they need to complete. And also this feeling of, is anyone even going to read this or use these data? And so what I was thinking about here is we have now as sort of a first step into what kind of structured machine readable data we could all generate, right? But there's still not a lot known, or there's still big question marks. It seems like each entity, and we could see this today, has their own way of measuring ESG data, carbon footprint. And actually, I'll show the list way in just a moment. And so we have all these different data providers. We're doing our own data. And then we have the first kind of hint of what could be a sort of meeting the regulatory requirements and having a machine-readable format that everyone could use. How can new technologies help with managing these data?
So I think essentially the challenge is not a technological one in the sense that we now have several fascinating technologies at our fingertips that we can start using to try and solve these problems. And we mentioned some of them, blockchain, AI, etc. So that's not where the problem is. The technology is there that we might want to use. But I think you've mentioned exactly what the challenge is. How do you come up with the standard? How do you decide who collects the data, who validates the data? These are the challenges I think we have to solve before we start looking at how the technology can then help us solve that problem.
Yeah, I'll be really curious to see what happens in the next few months, years, because right now it does seem like we're all flying solo in a bit, trying to come up with our own way, just because the regulations are making us do that, but the data are not yet really there. The companies are not yet forced to disclose that kind of information. So yeah, it would be really interesting to see what happens and whether, and I hope, governments do this in a smart way and that the data are stored publicly and in a nice format that we can actually all access it easily and readily. Okay, looking ahead to one other thing I wanted to draw people's attention to. So if you haven't had a look at the European ESG template, I do encourage you to do that, just to see all the data that so the European ESG template was put together by Findatex, I think a working group of 80 people across the industry who said that, these are all of the fields that asset managers or fund managers will need to complete. So for each type of share class, each ISIN number, you complete an entire row on this huge table. is that it looks like there's a lot of different environmental indicators in there. There's greenhouse gas emissions, there's water use, there's land use, there's particulate matter emissions, et cetera. It goes on and on and on for all of these, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What's your investment strategy? What's the social impacts? It seems like a lot. And I also wonder whether we will actually be putting in any number versus like a wrong number. What's better? And also, are all of these fields always salient for every type of investment that we do? It's another thing. So I kind of, I'm backtracking in the sense that, 2 years ago I would have said, we desperately need something like the ESG template because people are reporting whatever they want and there's no standardized format. But now that I see it, I worry. I don't know how this will actually work, and there's no field for you to put a comment. There's really only the number, and that's it. So, yeah, basically I have no answer, just a comment that it will be really interesting to see how this moves forward. All right, so when do you see a kind of consensus emerging on the type and format of reporting and also the method of storing the data? So do you think that this is specifically something that is for blockchain, or this is something that would be stored by EU regulatory agency? Or is this the kind of information where, it's global, it's coming from all over the world? How will this data be stored?
I think in terms of your first question, when are we going to reach consensus? I think I'm hopeful because we have pressure on the one hand from investors who want to start making informed decisions about their investments and the impact of their investments. And on the other side, we also have the pressure from regulators to get that data model up and running. I think if we look at the past in terms of the risk models we have today, where we measure risk and return, it took a while to get where we are today. We have now very mature data models to measure risk and return. And I think there's no reason why we can't do the same for these new models that we want, so impact and return. But what you mentioned now, this working group is a great start. I mean, it's the beginning. There's a lot of things happening. There's maybe a lot of confusion as well. But that's just a starting point of a journey towards, hopefully, a model which will work as well as the risk and return model we have today, which unfortunately doesn't take into account the impact that we want it to take into account. In terms of blockchain, you also mentioned, I think it's possibly a great solution here as well, because blockchain is very good at managing a golden source of truth. So a single source of information that anyone can refer to in terms of the data that they're looking at. But the same challenge exists with blockchain as for any other database, the garbage in, garbage out principle. In fact, it's probably even more dangerous for blockchain because the last thing we all want is immutable, distributed, encrypted garbage to work with. But there are solutions for that as well. So you have so-called oracles, for example, that can help you structure and validate data that you've captured from the real world and prepare it for, to inject it into a blockchain network. So that's one solution. But again, there's also these hybrid solutions we mentioned before. Not everything has to be stored on a blockchain. You can have a hybrid model with on-chain and off-chain data. But again, yeah, we need to find the data model first and then look at how the technology can help us get there.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to switch to the slides. So we're going to talk a bit about how close do environmental and social scores get to actual company performance. I'm going to act like I know the solution, but before we go into that, if when you registered this morning, maybe you saw this brochure. So this is another work I'm involved in at LIST. It talks all about, climate change, and then even more importantly, what is our carbon footprint and how we can decarbonize. So I encourage you, if you feel like you know a lot about finance and maybe not that much about measuring environmental impacts, then take a look at this. It has all the answers. Okay, so here I'll be talking about what we call the refund model. And basically what we did was compute the life cycle environmental impacts of investment funds at the company and at the fund level. And this is all based on research of a PhD student at LIST. It's Joanna, wave your hand, she's sitting right there. So all questions go to her. Here just an overview. When we talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, if you haven't heard of that already, scope 1 emissions refers to emissions directly involved with your company. So basically the emissions coming out of your own smokestack. Then scope 2 emissions would be, for example, all the electricity you use, where the emissions come out of the smokestack of the power plant, right? Or don't if it's renewable power. And then scope 3 are either upstream, downstream emissions. In our case, we look only at upstream supply chain emissions. So this would basically be all of the impacts of a company's supply chain, so where all of its inputs come from. What do? We have a financial database, FactSet, and we have a input-output database called Axiobase. Axiobase is free and open to the public. It is a multi-regional, environmentally extended input-output database, which means that typically when you're talking about input-output database, they follow global trade through different sectors of the economy and all of the different trade routes we have in euros or dollars. But when I say environmentally extended, it means that this has been extended into including the environmental impact of all of these activities. So for example, textile manufacturing in Bangladesh or bread manufacturing in the US, right? This would be a sector country contained in Axiobase. So when we link that to FactSet, we have information on a company's country revenue breakdown. So we would know, for example, Siemens, how is Siemens broken down into its particular components, like all the things it does, and in which country does it do those. And then if we link it to Axiobase and these global trade, we know exactly where the inputs are coming from and what's kind of the kind of trade or country sector footprint of a company. So when we make this link, we can then talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental indicators. And then, so this was for the company level, then aggregating up to the fund level is not difficult. So here, showing you some model example output at the company level and at the fund level. Just some example companies, you see here that scope 3 emissions do matter differently for different types of companies, and same at the fund level. So I'm showing you at the top the weighted average carbon intensity and at the bottom the relative carbon footprint. But basically what you see is that including indirect scope 3 emissions doubles or even triples the total carbon exposure of an investment fund. So dealing and handling scope 3 emissions is important. Here you can see when we looked at the entire sample of SRI funds domiciled in Europe, which you see all the way on the right, that's the average of the sampled SRI funds. The direct and indirect impact is not that different from a lot of stock indices, so S&P 500, MSCI World, MSCI Europe. This actually mirrors something that we saw this morning or this afternoon, earlier this afternoon in Morningstar. So kind of seeing that, you know what, Article 8, Article 9 funds, yeah, they are different from Article 6 funds, but not always and not, consistently. And this is something that we see here as well, unfortunately. The other, we looked at many different environmental indicators, but we also looked at a social indicator here, vulnerable employment. So here you can see a lot of the companies broken down by sector. And if you look at the two colorful columns there on the right, we have the direct intensity, so 1,000 people per million euro revenue in vulnerable employment, and then the life cycle intensity all the way on the right. And you can see the cells that are more orange and then in particular red are performing very poorly. And unsurprisingly, for example, the mining sector, you have vulnerable employment more in the direct scope. So these would be people employed directly in the mine. Whereas then, for example, in agriculture and textiles, you have vulnerable employment more in the supply chain, so in the scope 3 portion. And that's it on my little discourse here. So here's the team, and you can see Joanna, and you can meet Joanna afterwards if you want to talk more about this research. Moving back to panel format. All right, so you saw how we've been thinking about measuring greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular our focus on scope 3 or supply chain. So I wanted to ask, what role do you think technologies could play in getting a better handle on these kind of supply chain emissions, given that also a lot of companies may not even know their entire supply chain? Like they might know their tier 1 suppliers, perhaps tier 2, but not tier 3, etc. So how can blockchain or any other digital solution help?
So since I'm a blockchain guy, I'll talk about blockchain again. But blockchain in combination with Internet of Things. And we actually already have some live use cases which are quite interesting. For example, I think it's Walmart in Canada. They actually use blockchain and lots of sensors to track the origination of the food that they sell. So literally from the farmer right to your dinner plate, you can trace back where your food came from, which transport route it took, and they capture all that kind of data. So there it's more for the purpose of origination, but you can imagine the exact same thing for other criteria that you want to measure. You could really get really granular even in terms of the driving style of a truck driver. How efficiently are they driving their truck? Are they taking the right routes? The possibilities are endless in terms of capturing real-time data. So there's really a lot that can be done there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I go shopping at Grandfray, and there I can see sometimes the distinction that these pineapple were transported by plane, and these pineapple were transported by boat. So I get the boat version. But I could see how this kind of information would really hand the consumers a lot of power, and that I hope that we'll all become a lot more aware of what could be possible, and try to actually, when we engage with companies, ask them how they measure, how they monitor, and how deep into their supply chain they are able to get this information. Because right now, when I'm looking at your typical ESG rating agencies, Morningstar excluded, we're friends now, that there is definitely a focus on scope 1, so direct things that are not necessarily always salient. So when we're talking about social impacts, what we typically imagine, or what I would imagine is like a normal person's response, would be more kind of human rights things, like, oh yeah, social, we need to make sure that workers are treated well. And whereas some of the indicators that you end up seeing are, okay, does the company have a sexual harassment policy in place? These kind of things that we've come to expect as very normal in corporations, that have no bearing on how workers in their supply chain are actually treated. So yeah, when you engage with companies, it would be great if you really focus on indirect effects, because this is really what sustainable finance is about. It's basically exporting good policy, right? So we want our money to go to things that better the planet and that treat people well. And so if this is our desire, we also need to make sure that companies are looking at their supply chain and not just at what's going on in their headquarters. Okay, that was my little rant. Right. So I'm wondering, that some of the information in these blockchains could be considered sensitive or private, right? So when you're putting together this kind of data platform, how can technology safeguard this privacy, and what parts would be then open for everyone to read and what parts wouldn't be?
So here again, often Bitcoin is taken as the example. So Bitcoin is a so-called public permissionless blockchain, which means that everyone can look at the history of transactions. So you can see the full ledger right back to the first transaction that was made. And the misconception sometimes is that every blockchain network has to work that way. But that's actually not true. You can build all kinds of different privacy layers within your blockchain network. As an industry, our knee-jerk reaction is often to go for so-called private blockchain solutions. So, for example, an enterprise solution like R3's Corda. The benefit of that is that you can really build a platform for your specific use case. You have control of everything. You can decide everything yourself. But in terms of privacy, the only real out-of-the-box privacy you get is that anyone who's not part of that closed network can't get in. Within that network, you still have to build those privacy layers around your data, which puts it at par as working with a public blockchain where you would have to do that work as well. So in terms of privacy, public or private are more or less at par. The same amount of work needs to go into building privacy layers. The added benefit of a public, in my opinion, a public blockchain, is interoperability. So, for example, if you choose Ethereum as your platform, everything you build will be compatible with the rest of the Ethereum ecosystem. So if any other market players are also building similar solutions on Ethereum, you can interface with them a lot more easily than if we all start building private blockchain solutions or even private centralized solutions for the data we want to manage. And the other benefit of public is the distributed system. So a truly distributed system has no single point of failure, versus a centralized system, if your servers go down, the whole system goes down.
So I could imagine this solution, or basically privacy concerns, not being a correct objection if, for example, I wanted to build a system that would allow suppliers to report their electricity used or emissions to produce a certain part that was used by, say, multiple automakers, right? And so the automakers couldn't say that, oh, but we don't want everyone to see what kind of price or what's our agreement with this supplier, but then this information could be hidden. But in general, the emission rate could indeed be public.
Exactly. So you could really define different stakeholders, the level of access they have, the data they can add or not, and what they're allowed to see or not. That's definitely possible.
All right. So one last question, which relates more to the social side. So if we have a blockchain that would try to elicit reporting of, say, wrongdoings in factories all over the world, as they are being reported now by journalists, could this kind of blockchain or artificial intelligence or something, your solutions, help in some way to empower factory workers to directly report wrongdoing? Can you think of a solution for this problem?
I mean, yes, you could use, you could build a system that allows people to report certain things. The question is, I guess, with human data entry is always how reliable that data entry is. How do you validate the information you get?
Is that a real person who said that?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Versus, and again, the sensors thing, you can use sensors to automatically capture certain conditions, for example, in a factory maybe. That's maybe a more reliable way of capturing some data, but obviously where human interpretation is needed, it's very tricky. I'd say that's maybe an area that needs a lot more thought before using digital solutions. Yeah.
Maybe we still need humans. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So, Flavio, what's your take-home message for everyone?
Take-home message. I guess that we have a really unique opportunity as an industry now to play our part in having a positive impact in terms of ESG. And I think what we're missing is really the sense of urgency to get that done as quickly as possible. The science is telling us, climate science is telling us clearly that we're running out of time. And so I think we need to accelerate and really start putting our heads together and building these data models that will allow us and will allow investors to make the right decisions for the future.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Flavio. And I encourage everyone, whoever wants to find out more about, climate change, carbon footprint, decarbonization, take a look at this. It contains all the answers. And I think you'll be a lot more confident when you engage with companies and talk more about their supply chain issues on the environmental and on the social side, so that we can really get the financial sector and industries in Europe and abroad on the path to net zero. So thanks, Flavio, and thanks, Lux.
Thanks very much
for hosting us.
So thank you very much to both our speakers for this very insightful discussion. We would like to open the floor to the audience for questions, and we already have a question from the online attendees. So the question comes from Mr. Julian Fromut. I hope I pronounced the name well. With regards to the European ESG template, what list would propose to replace this Excel file produced by fund managers for their distributors who need such Excel files for portfolio aggregation purposes? And to follow up on this question, any other digital solution would need to be adopted by the entire financial industry anyway? Shouldn't we rather expect the EU to set up European data register accessible to all?
Yes, I do hope so. So I have no, this is still on, right? Yeah. I have no desire to replace the European ESG template. I just want to kind of say my heart goes out to you, whoever has to fill it in. But yes, I think it's necessary. It provides all the numbers in a structured machine readable format. It doesn't allow you to put in any additional comments. So, there's pros and cons. We can immediately take this Excel file and input it into all the different kinds of models that we would all have. What LIST can do is help complete some of these cells. So especially when it comes to scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 distinctions. And so this is a field I find exciting. So trying to automate or get that data and get good coverage for all of the companies. So I should say that at least we have really, really good coverage when it comes to having this information for all companies. But yeah, excellent question. I agree. The European ESG template is necessary. And if you haven't looked at it, look at it. And I agree that in terms of digital solutions, for sure, this is a space where government needs to step in. Otherwise, we would have private entities going off in all sorts of different directions, and we would be, reinventing the wheel all the time. And we would also not get to lift the lid and see what they're actually doing. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, so I guess we can close this session, the last one for today. And we would like to invite you all to our networking event hosted by the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, which is going to take place at the Mudam Café. Thank you to the audience and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.